I'm Martha Morgan. I'm the Water Programs Director at the Nashua River Watershed Association. Welcome to our speakers tonight. This is, I think, the fourth or third climate impact speaker series that we're doing. And we have a couple more coming up after this, but we're very excited to have these folks from the Northeast Wilderness Trust. But first, I'm going to introduce Ralph Baker. Ralph is a board member, a vice president of the Nashua River Watershed Association, and he was the previous speaker on soils in March. And you can view that talk on our NRWA YouTube channel. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Ralph.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Ralph Baker, as Martha said, at NRWA's board VP. I'm a soil scientist and a resident of Fitchburg, and I chair the association's Climate Impact Committee. More about that group in a moment. For those of you who may not be familiar with the work of the Nashua River Watershed Association, we're a nonprofit environmental organization. And for over 50 years, the NRWA has provided water and land protection programs to the 32 communities in our watershed, which is located in north central Massachusetts and southern New Hampshire. We also provide environmental education programs to youth and adults like this one tonight. We're a member-supported organization. If you're not already a member, we hope you'll consider joining us. You can learn more about the NRWA on our website at www.nashuariverwatershed.org. A bit about the NRWA's Climate Impact Committee. It consists of board and staff members, and we support the NRWA's overall efforts to plan for, respond to, and mitigate climate impacts in the watershed. In an effort to deepen public understanding of the issues at hand, we created extensive web content that's available from our homepage under what we do /overview/climate impact web content. And our web content, which is quite extensive, is also downloadable from there as a PDF. So take a look. And now we're very grateful to our speakers. I'd like to introduce them both. Jon Liebowitz is the executive director of the Northeast Wilderness Trust based in Montpelier, Vermont. He's worked in the private land conservation field since graduating from Vermont Law School in 2011. And before joining Northeast Wilderness Trust, he was the executive director of Montezuma Land Conservancy in Colorado. He serves on the Rewilding Leadership Council, the steering committee of Wildlands and Woodlands, and is a co-owner of Wild Edge Brewing Collective. He lives in Middlesex, Vermont, where he serves on the Planning Commission. He enjoys wandering the woods behind his house, as do I, and maintaining a questionable obsession with houseplants. So on to Sophie Ehrhardt. Sophie coordinates the Wildlands Partnership and Wild Carbon Project that you'll be hearing more about. Her desire to be involved with protecting the forests and waters of the Northeast for all the species who reside there and to play a role addressing the challenges of climate change made Northeast Wilderness Trust a natural work habitat for her. Sophie has a bachelor's degree in classics from St. John's College and a master's degree in environmental law and policy from Vermont Law School. In her free time, Sophie enjoys paddling, walking among trees, and spying on birds. Indoors, she loves food, strategy, games, and family. Martha, let's go ahead and have Jon share his screen with us.
Thank you, Ralph and Martha, for having Northeast Wilderness Trust speaking with you today, or rather tonight, I should say. So we are both going to talk about wilderness conservation. This is going to be less about the nuts and bolts of forever wild conservation from a transactional perspective, but more about the ideas and the ethics behind wilderness conservation. And then we'll talk about some specific values that it brings, such as resilience, carbon storage, biodiversity protection, etc. So as Ralph said, I'm the executive director of the Wilderness Trust, which is the only regional land trust in the Northeast focused exclusively on rewilding and wilderness conservation. We work all across New England and the Adirondack region of New York, which is an area that encompasses parts of the Northern Acadian, Northern Piedmont, and North Atlantic coast ecoregions. Many people simply call this the Northern Forest. To the original human inhabitants, it's called Ndakina. And the Wilderness Trust now safeguards over 65,000 acres of wild lands through passive management, which is what we are involved in. All the land that the Wilderness Trust protects today are ancient forests of tomorrow. And thus, it could be said that we are in the business of rewilding the Northeast. So I want to start with a stark historic photograph that I love. History is a critical baseline on any conversation about conservation, but especially wilderness. For upwards of 12,000 years before European colonization, this land was a peopled wilderness, ancient, complex, and largely self-willed forests that we now called old growth or primary forest dominated the landscape. And living within, a part of, and belonging to that landscape, indigenous people lived durable lives for millennia. Though there were indeed people here, on a whole, through a combination of low population density, limited technology, and rich cultural practices that were in reciprocity with the land, the Northeast forests were largely free to express themselves, and natural processes guided the ebb and flow of life, the very characteristics of which are the core of what we call wilderness today. In that way, nameless as though it may have been, wilderness has always existed. So in what is essentially an ecological split second of time, all across the northern forest, European settlers cleared upwards of 3/4 of the forested landscape by the late 1800s. And this was a time of great ecological upheaval and likewise cultural upheaval for the people that live here. And wilderness is indeed a recent concept in the long history of human presence in our region. But so too is industrialization, urbanization, anthropogenic climate change, the extirpation of apex predators, the list goes on. And wilderness as a legal designation, which is what we are in the business of, certainly didn't need to exist hundreds of years ago. It simply existed. In a region that was once home to a few 100,000 people living close to the land, but is now home to over 35 or 34 million fossil fueled consumers like myself, living largely disconnected from the land, wilderness as a legal construct is necessary. It's a critical element in a strategic and resilient vision that also includes well-managed woodlands, farmlands, communities, and cities, and everything in between. So getting back to this photo, in Vermont, where I live, I'm talking to you from Montpelier, as one example, few forests at all existed below 2,000 feet elevation by the late 1800s. In this historic snapshot of the White River from a century ago, not far from where my family now spends our days swimming during the summer, it was taken during one of the many log drives. And this photograph, critically important to the beginning of the conversation, as it's a reminder that wilderness conservation is not about conserving pristine landscapes. It's about freedom and equity for the entire membership of life. And if you take only one thing away from this presentation, I hope that it's understanding that wilderness conservation is not about setting aside pristine, unpeopled landscapes, or even about the absence of people. It's about freedom for the whole community of life. And here's a picture of the White River today, the longest free-flowing tributary to the Connecticut River in its full reforested glory. Thankfully, our forests have regrown, but they have not fully recovered. In fact, we are privileged, I would argue, to live among the only temperate ecosystem on the planet that has expanded and gotten healthier over the past century on such a grand scale. However, even with the amazing reforestation that has occurred across the northern forest, the reality is that most of our forests are just teenagers between the ages of 50 and 100. And most of these forests will remain teenagers indefinitely, what I call teenage limbo through management. Less than 1% of New England is primary or old growth forest, but we have the tools and the knowledge to change that through rewilding. Rewilding, simply put, is allowing nature the necessary space to heal and restore the life-supporting functions that it provides. Rewilding also means defining humanity's relationship, changing our hearts with nature, and recognizing that we are one species among many, a very old idea that we need to bring back. Northeast Wilderness Trust was an initial endorser of the Global Charter for Rewilding the Earth and is a member of the Global Alliance for Rewilding. This is a growing international movement that includes everything from passive rewilding, as the Wilderness Trust most often practices, to hands-on reintroductions of missing species and predators, such as jaguar reintroductions in South America, to active restoration of bison in Europe. For anyone interested in this movement, this is all I'm going to talk about rewilding, but I would encourage you to Google the Global Charter for Rewilding the Earth, which was co-authored by Tom Butler, who is a founder of Northeast Wilderness Trust and our current senior fellow. To put wildlands and woodlands in context, both sides, or I should say two sides of the same coin, this is a map showing all of the conserved land in the Northeast, both public and private, and it is very impressive. Roughly a quarter of New England is conserved in some way. And though I keep saying New England, Northeast Wilderness Trust also works in New York, so that's why it's included in our maps. But again, the vast majority of these are conserved as managed woodlands. So remember what I said earlier, most of these forests are in teenage limbo and will remain so because of active management. Only a small fraction are protected as wilderness. So sear this into your mind. And now I'm going to pull back a layer. This is the exact same data with only forever wildlands being preserved, or the preservation of wildness around the region. Roughly 3% of our region is protected in a way that will guarantee that it grows old and complex and becomes the ancient forests of tomorrow. In other words, 97% of the Northeast is either developed, conserved to be managed, or simply at risk of development or open to management. Just 3% is legally protected in a way that will allow it to grow old, store carbon indefinitely, harbor the unique biodiversity that evolved with these ecosystems for millions of years. So what is wilderness? In its most brief, wilderness is land that is left to its own will. The roots of the word, or the root of the word wilderness, as described and researched in great detail by Jay Vest, a member of the Monacan Indian Nation, means will of the land, self-willed forests. That's how we most often describe what wilderness is. In a self-willed landscape, trees grow old and die on their own timeframes. Species form multiple generations. Forest complexity increases. Niche habitats are naturally created. Coarse woody debris dominates the landscape. Natural disturbances create dynamic, multi-aged forests. And all of this stuff, which could be called biomass, and is also represented by great complexity, increases year after year in a wild forests. Industry and extraction is strictly prohibited, as is usually motorized and mechanized recreation. So in sum, whether you call it wilderness, wildlands, forever wild, ecological reserves, there's a lot of names for it. These are places where natural processes direct the ebb and flow of life, and where the heavy hand of modern humans is put aside. Howard Zonheiser, primary author of the Wilderness Act of 1964, is pictured here at his family cabin in the Adirondacks. And he consciously used the obscure word untrammeled in the law's definition of wilderness. Not untrampled, but untrammeled. He did not use, and nowhere in the act is the word pristine or ancient or virginal or untouched or unpeopled, but the word used to describe wilderness is untrammeled. Untrammeled lands provide plants and animals with places where they will not be deprived of freedom of expression or action. The primary characteristic of wilderness and the way that Northeast Wilderness Trust practices our work is freedom. Freedom for the land to follow its own evolutionary path. And at Northeast Wilderness Trust, we say that wilderness is not simply a special kind of place, but rather a special commitment we make to a place. That commitment is, again, freedom to animals and to the natural processes that produce integrity, beauty, and diversity. So, if wilderness is a choice, then wilderness by definition can be found anywhere where humans decide to make this choice. It's a place where we decide to practice humility and observe self-control, and to recognize the hubris of believing not only that we know how to best manage every square inch of our landscape, but that we should manage every square inch of our landscape. It means to set some places aside, not for us, but for the millions of species that we share this planet with. It is, in some ways, an outright rejection of the idea of human as gardener to a domesticated planet. So the moment that Northeast Wilderness Trust protects a place, we're taking an intentional, radical step to step aside and let nature control its destiny. And that's the essence of our work. Like on this stunning property in Southeast Massachusetts, just 40 miles south of Fenway Park, on this property, 36 vernal pools in a great coastal plain pond are found on 350 acres that also happen to be right next door to a highway, a housing development, and a Walmart. And even in this urban context, as constrained as it may be, wildlife flourishes at what we call a vest pocket wilderness, and it's called Muddy Pond Wilderness Preserve. And it is indeed a wild place. And on it are spotted salamanders, wood frogs, and the globally rare Plymouth gentian flower. An absolute stunner if you get there at the right time of year. Another example on the opposite end of the spectrum, in one of the wildest places of New England in the Western Maine Mountains, we recently purchased 6,000 acres just a few months ago, which is now called the Grafton Forest Wilderness Preserve. And on here, it's the highest density of moose in the lower 48. There's lynx on the property. The entire spectrum of wild and charismatic megafauna of the Northeast live on this property. And likewise, another example, a property that we just purchased in December of 2021 is the Woodbury Mountain Preserve. It's now the largest non-governmental wilderness area in Vermont history. It's 6,000 acres as well. And on this property, marten, black bear, the whole spectrum again of big, wild, beautiful species roam this piece of wild, untrammeled land. So there are many reasons to conserve wilderness. Chief among them is that wild nature simply has a right to exist and holds immense intrinsic value. However, at Northeast Wilderness Trust, we also celebrate four distinct values: biodiversity, resilience, carbon storage, and reciprocity. I'm going to hand over the presentation to Sophie, and she'll discuss carbon. And then I will hop back on and discuss resilience, biodiversity, and reciprocity, and then conclude our presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A. So let me stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Sophie.
I'm Sophie Ehrhardt. I've been the Wildlands Partnership Coordinator at the Northeast Wilderness Trust since the fall of 2019. And at that point, when I started, the program was just a twinkle in John's eye. And since then, as we've developed the program, I've focused a great deal on carbon. and the intersection of carbon storage and land protection work. Like Jon said, I'm going to tell you about carbon storage in forests and how it is that trees are our natural allies in stabilizing the climate. But I have a confession to make before I start. I am not a scientist or a forester by training. And most of these beautiful slides I'm going to share with you, and the assemblage of these studies to explain this concept were put together by Mark Anderson, who's the chair of our board of directors at the Northeast Wilderness Trust. In his day job, he is the director of science for the Eastern region for the Nature Conservancy. And he's a brilliant scientist and a lovely man. And thanks to him, I have lots of beautiful slides and some really cool recent science to share with you. So the main takeaway of my entire presentation is that recent studies confirm that older forests have an incredible ability to absorb carbon and to continue storing vast amounts of it. And scientists have reported that simply protecting our forests so that they have the opportunity to mature, a process called proforestation, is among the most cost-efficient and immediate actions that we can take to confront climate change and biodiversity loss. So I'm going to go way back. So his first slide starts in about 1650, when a scientist named Jan or John, I don't know, Baptiste von Helmont asked, where does plant matter come from? And it's a funny question, right? Because we think that plants just grow up out of the ground. And as Mark says in his presentation, they do not grow up out of the ground. So the experiment they did here was pretty simple, very elegant. They took a 5-pound willow sapling, planted it in a large bucket with 200 pounds of soil. They had weighed the sapling and they'd weighed the soil. They took care of the plant, watered it for 5 years. And when they were finished, they reweighed the tree and the soil. Well, lo and behold, the tree weighs almost 170 pounds and the soil has only lost 0.2 of an ounce or 0.2 of a pound. So clearly, they concluded, well, I guess the plant didn't make itself up out of the soil. And they weren't sure where it came from. They hypothesized that maybe it came from the water. They'd been watering it that whole time. And it wasn't until about 100 years later that Joseph Priestley figured out that plants grow out of the air. They materialize out of the air around them and through a process that we now call photosynthesis. So they're extracting carbon from the air, they're converting it to matter. And when you look around and you see a huge tree or you see a very dense forest, all of that biomass came from the air, from carbon. So what is this big old oak tree doing? It's a living solar collector. Each leaf you can think about like a solar panel. It's a bright sunny day. It's got all its solar panels out. It's photosynthesizing like crazy. It's extracting carbon out of the atmosphere and transferring it down into through its roots, down through its trunk, down into its roots, and it's releasing oxygen. And the other thing that this tree is doing, which frankly was news to me, is that it's monitoring its environment. So humans have photoreceptors in our eyes, and we can see 4 types of light: red, blue, green, and light and dark. But plants also have photoreceptors all over them, mostly in their leaves, and they can detect 11 wavelengths of light, including infrared and ultraviolet. And they have growth responses to all of these wavelengths, types of light. So long ago, this tree, sensed that there wasn't any competition. There was nothing blocking the light on the sides, and it grew out, it spread out. And why did it do that? To maximize its solar panels, right? So it could put out more leaves and photosynthesize as much as possible. The other thing this tree is doing is breathing. So they don't have respiratory systems like we do, but all living cells respire, and they release carbon dioxide, and the leaves, the barks, the roots, the fine roots, they all respire a little bit. And a simple way to think about carbon is that it's a function of leaf area index. So how much carbon a tree pulls in is a function of the total amount of leaf area. But when we calculate how much net carbon is being collected, we have to consider how much carbon is being taken in, but also how much carbon is being lost through respiration. So for a while, there were a lot of debates about whether old trees actually sequester much carbon. And that's because older trees' metabolisms slow down. They respire a bit more, maybe the carbon collection slows down. And this was put to rest in 2014. There was a meta study, collected all these other studies on how much carbon was being sequestered related to the age of the trees. And it was in 6 countries. They had 400 species of tree, over 600,000 individual trees. And what it concluded was that the leaf area index far outweighs any differences in metabolism. And this, quote, a single big tree can add the same amount of carbon to the forest within a year as is contained in an entire mid-sized tree. So what that means is the sequestration done by a great big oak tree like this in 1 year equals all of the sequestration a small, younger, mid-sized tree has done in its entire life so far, like those first 15 or 20 years. So that was a remarkable finding. So you know enough about carbon now to guess what this hiker in Northeast Wilderness Trust Binney Hill Preserve is thinking. Awesome leaf area index. Well, not really, but you can see that there's solar collectors, right? Leaves in nearly every available space in the forest, you know, up high, in the middle, in the shrubs, the grasses, the ferns. And this is a forest behaving naturally. If left to run the show, forests maximize their leaf area index. So we know that forests, you know, like trees, maximize their leaf area indices. And in this study from GO, I guess you say is the name, 2019, they found that structurally complex forests have higher vegetation area indices, absorb more light, and used light more efficiently to power biomass production. So scientists in forests noticed, though, that the growth of trees does slow down as the trees and the stand of trees get older. And so they wonder, where does the extra carbon go, right? If it's not all going into tree growth. And that brings us to the second part of understanding carbon, which is storage. So carbon sequestration refers to how much carbon a forest takes up each year. And carbon storage has to do with how the forest accumulates and stores that carbon. And this is done through carbon pools. So the above ground pool of carbon, you know, are all the trunks and the canopies, the leaves, the woody debris on the ground. And the below ground carbon pool includes all of the carbon that's underground in the soil and the roots and the little fine roots. And the accumulation of all these pools equals the total carbon storage. And forests can store a massive amount of carbon. A lot of the recent research in carbon has gone into how trees transfer the carbon to those different pools over time. And the real breakthrough came in a study from 2016. Yeah, there is, it's Tamara Klein and team, and they published the study in Science. And what they did is they released labeled carbon into the upper canopy. And I don't know how you do that. I don't really know what it means to label carbon, but I know that scientists do it. And they tracked it as it moved through the system. And they found that much of the carbon was transferred rather quickly to the soil. And of that, up to 40% was being shared with other trees in the forest. So the forest was working as one giant organism, collecting and sharing carbon. Suzanne Simard has done a lot of work in this area, and one of her students mapped the carbon sharing between, you know, around a big mother tree in the forest. And that's what this green network diagram is here. It looks like a, I don't know, a computer switchboard or a neural network or something. Suzanne Simard, you might be familiar with from her book, Finding the Mother Tree. And if you like to read fiction, and if you haven't read Overstory, that's a novel where one of the stories is one of those books with many stories in it. And one of the stories is of a scientist working in the forest, a forester, and making these discoveries of what's going on among trees. And that's based on Suzanne Simard. So how does the carbon sharing actually happen? You know, what you see above ground is about half of the mass, the other half is in the roots and the fine roots underground, and those roots are connected to a fungal network, the mycorrhizal network. And this fungal network is key to how trees share carbon. The trees transfer carbon to the fungal network as food, and the fungal network helps release nutrients and transfer those nutrients back up to the trees, because trees are better at getting nutrients, getting carbon from the sunlight, from the air, and fungus is better at decomposing things like rocks and soil and getting nutrients out of that. So it's a symbiotic, beneficial relationship. But as I'm sure many of you know, the fungal networks also connect roots of other trees in the forest. So each tree is tapping into this network with its roots, and then the mycorrhizal network is sharing with all of the trees in the forest. So it's mixed species sharing. You know, when an oak tree brings some carbon into this system, the fungal network, and they're still studying this, and it's not really clear how it makes its decisions, how all the sharing and trading is done of the carbon, but it is sharing with all the different species. So the fungal network develops and grows as the forest grows and matures. And after a forest gets cleared, the fungal network gets really degraded and becomes less diverse. But over time, as the forest ages, the network does reconnect, it gets more diverse, and it stores a lot more carbon. So returning to the subject of forest ages and sequestration, you know, it just comes down to the fact that different ages of forest allocate their carbon differently. And when the stand is young, most of the carbon is allocated to above ground growth. After 80 to 90 years, more of the carbon is allocated to the other pools. So to recap, there was a time when scientists and foresters thought that because the above ground growth slows down and the individual trees' metabolism slow down, maybe the carbon just reaches an equilibrium and no new carbon is being stored. However, we now know this not to be true. There was another meta-study done in 2008, published in Nature, looked at 519 other studies and showed conclusively that old forests accumulate carbon for centuries and contain large quantities of it. So they store these carbon pools for a very long time. This page is about Catanzaro, I don't know how you say the name, from the University of Massachusetts, and Anthony D'Amato from our University of Vermont put out this little document on forest carbon. And when they talked about carbon storage, they talked about an amount, a volume. And when they talked about sequestration, they talked about a rate. And they found that the rate at which a forest sequesters carbon typically peaks when forests are young to intermediate age, 30 to 70 years old. And so the question came about, you know, do young, fast-growing forests sequester more carbon? And the answer turns out to be no. And you probably have a sense of why, you know, considering the leaf area index, but it's a little more complex than that. And I'm just going to quickly walk you through one more study, which was done by Beverly Law, his team out at Oregon State in the Ponderosa pine forests. And this is in Western Oregon. And she compared a young forest, recently clear cut, so it was 20-year-old trees, and an old forest, mixed aged, 50 to 250 years old, and meticulously measured all of, you know, each of these carbon pools and also all the fluxes due to sequestration and respiration. And when they measured the carbon stock, they found that the young forest had about half the stock of carbon stored in it as the old forest did, which isn't super surprising. I mean, you can see that the soil has lost some, you know, in the roots more. It's got more woody debris, right? Because there's refuse from the harvest, you know, on the top of the lying on the ground probably. But obviously, you know, the trunks, the branches, the foliage is much less than in the old forest that hadn't been cleared. Then they measured all the flux, right? So these arrows show the sequestration, so the carbon coming in. And you can see that the young forest, you know, it's pretty amazing considering how much less foliage it has. It's really sequestering at a pretty good rate, 357 in as opposed to this 472 in with the older forest. But what they found was that when they measured all the respiration, the carbon going out of the system from the soil, from the litter, from the trunk, from the foliage, the young forest was actually a carbon source, not a carbon sink. So it was losing or emitting 32 grams of carbon per meter squared of the forest every year, whereas the old forest was storing an additional 28 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. And so it takes about 30 years before the carbon gets up to what we'd call a carbon neutral state. And what this graph shows is moving from the left to the right, we're seeing the age of the forest since, you know, the time it was harvested in year 0. And going up from the bottom to the top, we're showing how much carbon is being gained by the system. And this gray line here is a carbon neutral place where, you know, you're not gaining or losing, you're just neutral. And the green line shows the rate of sequestration being done by the trees in the forest. And you can see it starts out pretty slowly when the forest is young, but at about year 20, it really kicks up and the rate, it's really sequestering at quite a high rate. And when it gets to around 30 years old, at this point, you know, it's essentially neutral for a little while. And it starts actually storing carbon at that point. But it takes another 50 years. You got to get to like 80 to 90 years before all the carbon lost in the first 30 years has been made up by the additional gains in these additional 50 years. So you can see at 30 to 70, you're at the highest rate, you know, of sequestration, but it's not until you get to 80 to 90 years that you can say, you know, you're carbon neutral. And so at this point, you've grown a bunch more wood and the rapid rate has offset the initial rate. And so you have a net carbon of 0. And at this point, it's fair to say you grew new wood with no carbon cost. But, you know, a break-even point isn't the same as an increase in carbon storage, right? Obviously, if you had this forest that you had never harvested and it had been sequestering carbon at its steady rate all along, you know, it will be storing by this same year quite a bit more carbon than the young forest that just started over. It's you know, it's like a bank account where your initial storage is your investment, your capital, and then additional sequestration is, you know, your interest every year going back in. And if you don't take all your money out in year 5, you're going to have more money come year, you know, 80 or whatever. So in the short term, while we're facing a climate crisis, you know, we don't necessarily have a lot of time to replenish our losses. So we have to figure out how to, you know, keep as much of this carbon in the ground as we can. And this is a really cool slide. I love this slide. So it shows, you know, it's talking about irrecoverable carbon. And by that, meaning the carbon that if we lose it now, we won't get it back in any realistic time to address climate change. And so first of all, what we should do is we should conserve all of it that we have, keep the carbon in the ground in these big systems. And in this chart, which is from a paper from 2020, it maps the carbon density of these various systems. So you can see like our mangroves and peatlands, as well as our old forests, are very dense in carbon. When you go up from the bottom to the top, what you're actually seeing is the total carbon stock on the planet. And so the old forests and the peatlands have dense carbon stocks, and there's a lot of it out there. And we should really try to keep that in the ground. And so where are these carbon stocks in the US? So in the Pacific Northwest, extremely, rich carbon stocks there, but followed by these stocks in New England and the Appalachians. And on soil carbon, it's a little, looks different. Along the eastern seaboard here, it's really these big peatlands in northern Maine and the Adirondacks, and then in the Everglades. So the cheapest, fastest way to get carbon out of our atmosphere is, first of all, to just avoid forest conversion. In this bar graph, there's some different kind of land, some activities we can do, ways we can try to get more carbon conserved. And this dark olive part of the bar, that's the low cost portion of the solution. And you can see that avoided forest conversion has got the most, low cost possibility. Now, it might not seem low cost to John, who has to fundraise to, get all these properties. But compared to a lot of other activities, you can see reforestation has a great potential, planting forests where we currently don't have them, areas that have already been cleared for agriculture, can also be effective, but it's expensive and it takes a lot longer. Like we said, you got to get these trees, they need quite a few years to really take off and get going. So natural forest management here, this third bar also has a good low cost portion. And that plays a huge role. That has ways that we can do harvest where we don't sacrifice so much of our carbon. And NEF, Northeast Forestry Foundation, Forest Society of Maine, the Nature Conservancy are working hard to bring important changes to harvest practices. But wildlands conservation is something we can all participate in. So at every level, our yards, family woodlots, town and state forests, the conservation efforts of land trusts. So, we can all have this rewilding and try to let whatever space we can fill in that leaf area index. I'm going to turn this back over to Jon because he's going to discuss resilience and biodiversity and reciprocity. But don't worry, I don't think it'll be quite so many graphs and charts. First, I just want to tell you that if you want to read Mark Anderson's paper on which this whole presentation really is based, it can be found on our website. You just go to our library, to our wild work section, and it's called Wild Carbon. And then he has an update, Wild Carbon 0.1 or something. And the great thing is he has the references for all the scientific studies that I shared in this presentation in case you want to look some of that up yourself. So I will stop sharing and I look forward to our conversation later and let Jon take it from here.
All right, thanks, Sophie. Let me see if I can work this screen sharing magic one more time. All right, how does that look? Good. All right, so I'm just going to share, let's see, I think I have 3 more slides and then we'll get to Q&A, which I'm very excited to field questions. And just so everyone knows, it's 7:48 and I know that the presenters are willing to stay here till 8:30. So we're, if everyone's willing to hang around, and we've got a good chunk of time for a conversation and Q&A. So I'm going to talk briefly about biodiversity and resilience. So look at this beautiful, old, messy, and mossy forest. This is what a wild and resilient forest brimming with life looks like in the Northeast. This photo was taken from our Howland Research Forest in Maine. So this is northern New England, and it captures a lot of why wild forests are so important to biodiversity. Howland Research Forest was purchased by Northeast Wilderness Trust in 2007 to save it from being logged, and it is home to trees that were just approaching middle age when Henry David Thoreau wrote those words describing the Maine woods. It's all mossy and moosey. A couple of years ago, a hemlock fell in the forest and it was cored, and it was about 400 years old. So it's a stunning forest with some really beautiful old trees. So again, what's so special about this forest? Well, look at the tip-ups and the moss-covered forest floor and the lichen, the fallen trees and the cavities that they create. Coarse woody debris is everywhere, a mosaic of old trees and young trees. This complexity, not only beautiful, but it also creates resilience and harbors incredible biodiversity. This is what a forest wants to look like if it's left alone. And it's all about this complexity, a word that I'll keep returning to. Complexity comes naturally simply by taking a step back and letting multiple generations of a living system grow, die, and regenerate without removing anything from that system, i.e. logging. Viewing forest health through the lens of habitat rather than board feet can be defined in part by the amount of coarse woody debris that's present. And in a healthy, temperate northern forest, like the one that we live in, up to 30% of all of the woody biomass in a forest could be in the form of coarse woody debris, snags, down trees, etc. This complex forest structure supports myriad niche habitats, often absent from young and managed forests. And with those niche habitats come countless species that evolved over millions of years to rely on them. Life is abundant in untrammeled forests, and species richness has been well documented in wild forests to exceed those of managed forests. Vast interconnected landscapes that include wild and complex forests offer the best hope for wildlife to survive and adapt to climate change. But what about the forests themselves? Wild resilience has a lot to do with what happens below the surface and not only above it. And this is a chart that Sophie shared as well, but I'll just discuss it briefly. In wild forests where soil is left undisturbed, complexity increases, and vast mycorrhizal networks help trees, especially older ones, sometimes now called mother trees, share carbon between one another and even between different species. And these networks become more connected the less disturbed and older a forest is, as shown by this chart showing fungal networks across 3 age classes. So finally, reciprocity. The intentional act of setting aside a piece of land for its own intrinsic value requires a dose of humility, and rewilding the mind, we believe at Northeast Wilderness Trust, is part of that humility. And at a societal level, it is equally as important as rewilding the land because one won't happen without the other. Reciprocity is both the rekindling of our affection for the wild and the practice of this awakening. Connecting with untrammeled places is integral to cultivating an ethical foundation which guarantees the preservation of diverse and resilient and self-willed ecological communities. And when other forms of life are honored for their own sake and granted the freedom to flourish, the wonder of the natural world becomes increasingly tangible. These experiences are both exchanges and instructions, and they transform us physically, spiritually, and they inspire the wisdom and compassion needed to protect and pass on a beautiful, vigorous, and wild world. So that is how we describe reciprocity, and it's why we at Northeast Wilderness Trust conserve wild places. We are dedicated to the reciprocal act of offering our wild neighbors, our cousins, our family, places where they may rest, recover, and thrive in perpetuity. I am gonna skip a couple slides in the interest of time and get to the big question of how much is enough? How much wilderness ought to exist across the northern forest? And what does that mean for you and me, human beings? How can we learn from our past and reawaken our relationship with nature and chart a resilient course for the future? How do we approach conservation holistically and find a very important balance between well-managed woodlands and wildlands and farmland and towns and cities, all while doing that, shifting the dominant culture's relationship with nature to create a durable future for people and our wild kin? The two existential crises that we face at this very moment, climate change and loss of biodiversity, are symptoms of overexploitation in a hyper-consumptive lifestyle that is largely disconnected from nature. A lifestyle that, of course, I belong to, as I'm here on my computer talking to you. And the question that I ask myself every day is, how can we create a durable civilization in which humans, in the aggregate, once again become good neighbors in that community of life? Everyone here today, and everyone I've ever talked to, done this presentation to, is engaged in the modern economy that has plundered the planet and continues to do so. And if you use a computer or a smartphone or fly on airplanes or eat oranges during the winter or are connected to the electric grid, whatever that is, we are all part of the same modern economy and modern system and way of life. So can we balance that modern existence with the technologies and comforts that we all use and enjoy and benefit from, and do so in balance with nature? How can we do that? Unsurprising, perhaps, is my answer, is more wilderness. I believe that we can reach that balance through rewilding, through welcoming home apex predators to the Northeast, and redefining our place on the planet as one species among many. Welcoming back complexity, taking a step back. When we set places aside as wilderness, we help expand the boundaries of ethical consideration to the entire community of life. And by protecting self-willed lands in all of the members of life, human and non-humans alike, we can simultaneously conserve immense amount of biodiversity and store and sequester immense amounts of carbon. When we set aside wilderness, we create lifeboats for biodiversity to persist, evolution to continue, and we secure places for humans to find solace and reconnect with nature, our home. While beyond the scope of our work at Northeast Wilderness Trust, efforts to rewild the world and rewild the landscape have to be matched with a reimagining of the human experience. So what should the exact number of wildlands be in New England? I don't have an exact number, and Northeast Wilderness Trust doesn't peg an exact number. So I'm sorry to disappoint, but it probably lies somewhere between the most conservative number, which comes out of the Wildlands and Woodlands Initiative, of which we're proud supporters, and that's 7% of the landscape, or 10% of all conserved forests, and 50%, which is what E.O. Wilson, the late scientist, claimed was what was needed to protect biodiversity on planet Earth. To quote a radical author and someone that I love her writing, Eileen Christ, she says that by protecting nature generously and simultaneously contracting and transforming the human enterprise, we can create the conditions for achieving justice and well-being for both people and other species. If we fail to do so, we instead accept a chaotic and impoverished world that will be dangerous for all of us. So that is the work that we are engaged in Northeast Wilderness Trust, partnering with nature, rewilding the Northeast, and trying to rewild ourselves. So I'm going to finish with a quote that I love from Albert Einstein, and he wrote many years ago, "Our task must be to free ourselves by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty." A man that was embracing rewilding long before the term was coined. So thank you very much for listening to Sophie and I. Such a pleasure to speak with you, and I am excited to answer some questions for the next 30 minutes or so, if people want to stick around.
Thank you so much, John and Sophie. That was excellent. Really,
It was excellent.
really great.
Before we get started with the question and answer, I just want to remind people that we have a couple more talks coming up in our series, and I want to share a slide and just remind you to please sign up for these particular talks. So I will do that real quickly. So these are two talks coming up in May 26th and Thursday, June 9th. The first one is the impacts of climate change on rivers and streams with Sarah Whiting, who's a board member and also a professional engineer and a senior water resources engineer at Interfluve. And then on June 9th, torrential rains from slow-moving tropical systems. And this is by David Valley, who has spoken to us at our annual meeting in the past, and had another talk that he did at the River Resource Center. I encourage everybody to please sign up for those. But thank you, and let's get to the question and answers portion.
All right. I would
We
like
have some
to...
in the question and answer and some in chat. So
Right. So there's quite a few that have come in, and I guess if people want to raise their hands, that would be a way to actually let folks ask their own question. But I'll read the one that Glenn Ayers offered near the beginning of the presentation. He writes, "In Massachusetts, we typically have millions of dollars available from the state every year for land trusts to develop conservation restrictions for working forests, but the state never allocates any funding toward forever wild CRs or fee acquisition for wild lands. This same funding disparity flows from the federal government in its Forest Legacy Program. How can we change this funding picture so that land acquisition and CRs for wild forest protection and wilderness rewilding are prioritized in light of the climate emergency?"
Thank you, Glenn, for the question. A good one. So there is, I guess I could start by saying historically, a vast majority of wilderness, wildlands, forever wild preserves have been protected through private philanthropy. And in fact, there's a beautiful book written by Tom Butler called Wildlands Philanthropy that's all about this rich American tradition of supporting wilderness conservation. And you're absolutely right, Glenn, there's been very little public funding for this type of conservation because public funding is often tied directly to economic benefit and some of these things that are much more apparent and easily explainable when you're protecting managed forests. Nonetheless, I can tell you that as someone in the thick of fundraising for wilderness conservation, things are changing, and we are finding more and more public sources of funding, even just over the last 1.5 to 2 years, that are supporting wild conservation in the name of biodiversity preservation, watershed protection. There's no better way to protect headwaters, for instance, than wild and unmanaged forests. And we are seeing more and more support from the public domain. In terms of Massachusetts as a specific example, I don't have a good answer for you, unfortunately, but I think more conversations like this that we're having people like you, Glenn, going to your local legislators and telling them how important it is to support more wild forests, I think will continue to turn the tide, and it certainly is changing, which is optimistic from my perspective.
Thank you, John. So a question came up early in the chat. What does all this mean for forests that have been exposed to intense forest fires? How long does it take for sequestration rates to recover? That's very, very timely as we enter, unfortunately, into another forest fire season.
I can take a stab at that. So, of course, the Northeast, we are lucky to live in a region that has fewer forest fires than out West. So let's, we can kind of start there. Our forests certainly are in a much longer rotation. Fires are part of our natural systems here, but not like they are in the Everglades, for instance, or out West in dry ponderosa forests. There has been some real, I'm looking to the left because I saw this question, pulled up some data that I recently read on my other screen. There's been some recent studies, and I can just say to go Google a study that's written by Harmon, Harmon et al. 2022. It's a brand new study that shows that out West, big forest fires are mostly low to moderate intensity in mature and wild forests, and only a tiny fraction of tree biomass is consumed during those forest fires, even when they're widespread and burn thousands or hundreds of thousands of acres. The study found that less than 2% consumption of tree biomass across these huge fires. And when you compare that to a logging operation where 20 to 50% of tree biomass is removed from a forest in some cases, it's kind of an apples to oranges comparison. One of the other studies that I don't have in front of me, but Mark Anderson talks about in one of his presentations, is about Mount St. Helens and how quickly after that volcanic eruption occurred, the wild forest that's surrounding it recovered, because the resilience that Sophie and I talked about through the duff layer and all those multiple myriad niche habitats that are created in a wild forest became seed banks for a future forest. Scientists were quite blown away by how quickly that forest recovered from complete destruction, that is volcanic destruction. So forests have an uncanny ability to respond to natural disturbances. Just look at New England, which was totally deforested just a century ago, and now we have this beautiful forest that we live in. So forests have an ability to recover, and what we have found is if we just give it time and space, whether it's a forest fire or infestation of invasive species or natural species, they can recover. And that's really what we're in the business of trying to foster, not across the entire landscape. We don't think the entire landscape should be wild, but if more places were wild, I think there would be more places that recovered in such a fashion.
Well, thank you, Lee Hort, for that question. And we could go quite a bit more into it, but one of the things I take from it is the prevailing sentiment that after big forest fires, people should go in and log the forest to reduce its tendency to burn is a big mistake. Okay, on to a different topic that's quite current. I see Rick Mulkey has asked, do you sell carbon credits? Why or why not?
I'm gonna let Sophie field this one.
Hi. Yes, we do. And, at the 10,000 foot level, we sell them because we can fund our conservation work by doing this. And while we know that we need to protect the irrevocable carbon stores, there's not a tremendous amount of funding to do so. And what we've tried to do is to work in this space ethically. And we were fortunate that our carbon projects launched not at the very beginning when the Nature Conservancy and Mass Audubon had done some work and received a lot of criticism for it. We got to read some of those criticisms and take them to heart. And the funding that's available for, by selling carbon credits is significant. But the issues have been with the way the protocols have been set up. I don't want to get too super weedy here, but for those of you who are familiar with it, most of the carbon projects that have been developed by Land Trust use the improved forest management protocol out of the American Carbon Registry. And that's been faulted by some for how they decide how many credits to allocate to the project. And the main criticisms we read early on about carbon projects on conserved land was the idea with a carbon project is that some organization, university, industry, whatever it is creating emissions, and they want to offset those emissions by investing in a project that will store and sequester additional carbon to kind of balance their footprint. And one of the some of the criticisms that came out when the Nature Conservancy developed these kind of projects in Mass Audubon were one, that they had owned these properties a long time and had not, according to some of the criticism, had not planned to log them. Now that might be true. I don't know about Mass Audubon, but most land trusts, do resort to some logging eventually, and the Nature Conservancy certainly does log its lands. But in any case, they said you've owned them all this time and you haven't logged them, so there's not any real additional carbon storage happening. You're selling these carbon credits, but that sequestration, that storage would have happened anyway, even if this business hadn't bought your credits. So that was one criticism. And then the other main one was that they didn't, with those projects, do anything to change the protected level of the property. So the land trust owned the property, but they didn't have the kind of legal permanent restriction on harvest. And the reason this matters is if you're talking about carbon storage, the carbon projects that are developed under the improved forest management protocol last for 40 years. That's how long you have to verify your carbon storage with the registry. After that point, you've been, given the credits for those years that you were, maintaining these carbon pools. But after that, you can go in and log that forest and release all that carbon. And that's why these carbon projects, they work pretty well with forestry, because guess what? You can let those trees grow. You can reduce your harvest scenario and get credited for that increased sequestration and storage. If you had clear cut these trees, obviously you would have lost a bunch of carbon and the trees wouldn't have been there to pull more out of the air. But if you reduce your harvest, then there's a savings there, and you should get paid for that. And those are actually good programs, because in the short term, we do need to harvest more sustainably. And the Nature Conservancy has used this to fund a lot of work to really encourage landowners to use better forest management practices, not clear cut, selectively cut, do things, reduce their harvest. But the criticism came in because they said, well, on the ones that, some of these land trusts own, they didn't actually, they'd owned it a long time and they didn't add any further protection to it. And so when we designed our carbon projects, we addressed those concerns by only enrolling newly conserved properties. And as soon as we bought them, enrolled them in a carbon project, we then followed up by putting a forever wild conservation easement on it to make the storage permanent. And we feel like done this way, it's real additionality, and it's as permanent, as nature will allow. And it's really important, I think, revenue for land protection work. I also, we've evolved even further in our thinking on this, and we're moving towards a model. The Woodbury Mountain Preserve that Jon shared in his presentation, which is about 6,000 acres. Jon, it's the one he said, it was in Vermont. So we actually, we sold carbon credits on that property before we bought it. You can believe this. So basically what happened is we worked with a carbon project developer, a carbon buyer, and Northeast Wilderness Trust. And basically they gave us the money to buy the property. And the property was owned. It was owned by a family that did timber. I mean, it was plucked off of the open timber market and conserved with the carbon money. And with the understanding, very complicated tripartite legal agreements, futures contracts, and all this. But basically, we were obliged then to take their money and buy the property. If we couldn't buy the property, we'd have given them their money back. But we did. We enrolled it in a carbon project. It is now Forever Wild. And yes, we will get carbon revenue for that, because we are going to be stewarding that in perpetuity, keeping that carbon in the ground. So that's our take on carbon. I can say a lot more things, but I won't, because we have a lot of other questions, but I hope that helps. Great,
thank you.
Yeah.
There's several questions around the topic of invasives, non-native species. When you acquire a property, Tom Cotton asks, what do you do if you find non-native species? And Rick Mulkey says, what's your feeling about control of exotic invasives?
Jon, do you want to share your slide? You've got a slide on that, don't you? Maybe you don't have a slide. Maybe you just talk.
Well, I could talk a little bit about that. And this is one of the topics that inevitably always comes up. It's something we all think about and we all hear about a lot, because as our climate warms and in our society of globalization, we're always trading insects from around the world. So invasive species are something that is important and something to think about. So let me first say that on Northeast Wilderness Trust properties, we take a hands-off approach to invasive species management. If you return to the idea of when I talked about wilderness in context, again, that statistic is that about 97% of our landscape is developed or managed, degraded, or whatever it may be. And we know that invasives thrive on disturbance. So in a landscape that is actively and regularly disturbed, as whether it is as good a timber job as possible or even recreation, invasives will thrive in a disturbed area. So what we have found on Northeast Wilderness Trust preserves, and this is anecdotal, this is not a scientific, peer-reviewed study, but on forest preserves that we own where there's a closed canopy and very little disturbance, because we don't allow any timber harvesting and recreation is allowed, but limited. It's not industrial level recreation, if you want to use that word. Invasive species are sometimes present, but they don't spread much on our properties. And we have a stewardship team that goes out and monitors them. We know where these plants are and we keep an eye on them. And it hasn't risen to the level on any of our properties where we actually had to take an active step to remove invasive species because they were becoming a problem. We weigh the cost against the benefit. And the cost, both real money and the introduction of disturbance to the forest, we have judged in almost every case outweighs the benefit of removing that species. Now, I'm talking about plants, and you may also be asking, well, what about the kind of invasives that fly around? The reality as we see it is that species like emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid, etc., they are going to come whether we spend millions of dollars trying to get rid of them or not. And they're going to change the composition of our forests. And rather than mourn that, we think about it in another way. First, there's going to be an enormous influx of coarse woody debris in our forests if a certain invasive comes and knocks out a big chunk of ash trees, for instance. And we also look at the forests not as a static ecosystem, but a dynamic living world that is going to change whether we want to or not, and whether we pour poisons all over our forests or not, or whether we release other invasive species that we deem to be good because they eat some other invasive species. This is all, it's all out of our control to a certain extent. And Northeast Wilderness Trust, on our lands, we're just saying we're going to take a hands-off approach. Now, I want to be really clear that I am not, placing judgment, and Northeast Wilderness Trust is not placing judgment on people that choose to manage invasives on their properties, or land trusts that manage invasives on their properties. We're just arguing that there ought to be some places on the landscape where we're taking a hands-off approach and seeing what nature has in store. And those places, very few, 3% of the land, are going to act as the baselines for the rest of the landscape and act as the living laboratories for the rest of the landscape, and see what nature is going to do in spite or in light of all of this immense amounts of change happening right now through climate change and the presence of new species.
I think it's very important to emphasize that role that reserves and preserves can play in helping us to understand what nature alone would do. All right, we're running into, probably we're not going to be able to pose every question, but I'd like to ask this one on behalf of Stacy Chilcote, our Director of Education at the NRWA. As far as carbon sequestration is concerned, is there a difference between deciduous and coniferous forests? Are all forests fairly equal at a set lifetime, i.e. 30 years at carbon neutral?
I'm not deeply immersed in the science, but I have heard Mark Anderson talk about that, and I've seen some slides that he has. And I think in general that your coniferous, your softwoods are sort of less than the deciduous, the hardwoods. John, is that your understanding of it as well? I mean, it's a little bit nuanced. I remember his chart wasn't like quite as simple as that. And I'm sure there is variation between tree species as far as, I think that's why it said 20 to 30 years and not like 22 years exactly. And why it said the forest takes, 80 to 90 years to kind of reach that, net zero point.
Yeah, there's slight variations, but the trends are largely the same. And that's kind of the important piece of it is it takes a long time to replace the carbon lost of a harvested site, whether you're talking about a ponderosa forest or a maple forest. The numbers are slightly different, but the trends are largely the same.
Another member of our organization, Jessica Vesey-Powell, asks, besides the UMass UVM study, were any of the studies Sophie referenced from New England forests? I'm wondering about the transferability of the results through the meta-analysis where we're from various geographic locations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they're kind of all over the place. I think there was that one that was Stephenson et al. That was right at the beginning, that synthesized a bunch of different studies. And the US, of course, was included. It was one of the 6 countries, and it had a broad, across the US. But I think the Klein study was done in German forests, and the Goch and et al. That was quoted on that slide about sequestration and the annual uptake about the structurally complex forest. That was temperate forests in the East, and it was, but it was not just in New England, like Harvard forests were part of that group, but so were some of the Great Smoky Mountains and Notre Dame's forests. And I mean, I just kind of looked at the list, but so I think there is pretty good transference there. And I guess the best way to answer that question in depth would be to look at that, the study by the paper by Mark Anderson, and look at the references there and check out those studies. But I know that, I have so much respect for Mark's science that I feel very confident that he wouldn't have used studies that were not applicable in this discussion. But I would say look them up yourself for the exact locations on more of them.
After this, I will send Ralph and Martha 2 recent studies that have come out of the Northeast for people to look at. The first is older eastern white pines accumulating carbon for many decades, and that's a study by Bob Leverett, Susan Messino, and Professor Muma. And then another really interesting study that just came out of the Howland Research Forest is about the multi-decade carbon cycle measurements and how they resist external drivers of climate change at Howland, which is an old growth forest. I will share both of those with Martha and Ralph, and then you can send out to the registrants for those that are interested.
Good idea, thank you.
Okay, we're probably near the end, but I will try to include one that Margaret Williams asked. Are there areas you're protecting being designated as federally protected wilderness? If not, is that a goal? And in non-federally designated areas that you manage, what sorts of rules apply to Northeast wilderness to manage the impact that people can have? Bans on motorized vehicles, rules about mountain bikes, should drones be allowed?
All right, I'll answer this one quickly, and maybe we can squeak in another one. We do not transfer our land to the federal domain. On every property that we own, we employ a conservation strategy called belt and suspenders strategy of conservation, which basically means we own it as a land trust, and then we will always donate a forever wild easement to another land trust, which ensures its long-term durability and protection. All of our lands are protected as forever wild, and we base that on the federal designation and using the same rules. So on all of our properties, mountain bikes are prohibited, mechanized recreation is prohibited, recreation that leaves tools behind, like rock climbing with mechanical means that are like bolted into cliffs, that's prohibited. We do allow limited hunting, which I know is another question. So we allow hunting of deer. We prohibit outright all hunting of predators. We also prohibit outright trapping of all animals. So in many ways, we mimic the federal designation standards, but we keep it in the private domain. We keep land sometimes on the tax rolls, and it's all protected by forever wild conservation.
Great. And I'll squeeze one in. That's
all right.
Very interesting. What do you say to people who claim that wilderness is the product of white colonialism?
Oh, all right. Well, that's a hard one to answer in 2 minutes. But what I would say is, well, first, I respectfully reject that idea. I understand where it's coming from, and I have great respect for this conversation that's going on around conservation in general, and especially wilderness. If you were there, whoever asked that, if you were there at the beginning of the presentation, we think about wilderness as something that has existed forever. Untrammeled being the primary defining piece of wilderness is a idea. It's a state of being that has existed forever. And it has coexisted with people forever, or for as long as people have been here. And so when you think about wilderness in that context, it is certainly not an idea that has been created out of nowhere recently. It's just that in the world that we live in today, with billions of people and a fossil fuel powered population that has immense capabilities of extracting resources and disturbing our earth, wilderness is a needed legal construct for honoring and for ensuring that there are some sanctuaries and special places left on the landscape. Not a good answer, but it is 8:30. I do want to share, I think if I just type this into the Q&A thing, you'll see this, a really brilliant.
Try doing the chat instead.
You all see
More
that?
people see it.
I think
we would only see the question and answer, but in the chat.
Okay, I think I just put it in the chat, but that is, it's a wonderful essay that's written by a guy named Roger Kay and a couple Native Americans. And it's called Wilderness and Traditional Indigenous Beliefs, Conflicting or Intersecting Perspectives on the Human-Nature Relationship. It's a thought-provoking essay. And I think it does a really good job at addressing the question that you had, which is a really important question and one that we think a lot about. Sorry, I couldn't give it a better answer.
No, that's great. And I'd like to thank you and Sophie for doing such a good job of trying to address these questions. There's a lot of other ones that we didn't get to. Apologize for that. But I would encourage folks to look in the chat at all the great references that people have provided, and maybe take a few moments before we close this to copy those that you're interested in.
Sue Edwards raised her hand.
Okay.
Well,
if we want to run a little late, we can
just maybe real quickly. I just had her and I can't find her. I don't see your hand raised. I saw that it went up, and then I'm not finding your name here.
Well, her question was written into the Q&A. Would there ever be a reason in the Northeast for transforming one type of protected forest habitat into another through selective deforestation, burning, and the use of herbicides? Yeah. I don't know if that can be quickly answered or not.
Right.
I would just say that, we should take an all of the above approach to conservation. Currently, a teeny sliver of the landscape is protected as wilderness. And what we're arguing is that it needs to just be a bigger slice of the pie. There needs to be more wild places, in part with a comprehensive, holistic strategy for more sustainable woodlands, more industrial woodlands to supply the forest products we all need, and a lot more wildness, good farms, etc. It's not an either or situation. It's an all of the above, and doing the best we can to be good neighbors in the community of life.
Well, that sounds like a great last statement. I'd like to thank our speakers and our audience for a really interesting evening, and I encourage folks to come next time.
And we will be sending out a link to the presentation, so look for that.
Those who have registered will receive a link to the recording, right?
And it's going to be shareable on our YouTube. So Thank you
Excellent.
very much.
Well,
Yeah, and
thanks.
visit our website if you have more questions or want to contact us, anywildernesstrust.org.
Thanks for having us, and thanks for coming, everyone, and spending the time to have the conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both very
Yep.
much.
Good
It's
night.
excellent.
All right.
Good night.
Good night now.